In continuing with our discussion of the First Amendment and free speech and speech that may rise to the level of becoming unprotected speech, I want to talk about three categories. Now, there are many more categories, but most of them are more technical and end up in civil court, such as slander or defamation or even plagiarism. And I want to focus on the main three, which seem to carry the potential of imminent lawless action or violence or harm. These are the types of unprotected speech which may require the intervention of a police officer to make an arrest or to prevent that speech from being broadcast. And so there are three categories here. The first category is called incitement. Basically, incitement is any speech that causes others to undertake the commission of illegal or harmful actions. So, as an example, in 1969, Brandenburg versus Ohio, the Supreme Court of the United States held that the First Amendment does not protect speech that is, quote, directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action, end of quote. In other words, mere advocacy of lawbreaking or violence remains protected speech as long as it is not intended to and likely to provoke immediate unlawful action. So there's a requirement of intention here. Basically, there were two measures that the court had used in the past in order to determine whether speech crossed the threshold and became incitement. The first was bad tendency, and that would be speech that tends to harm the public welfare. That would not be protected. Now, that is extremely broad and vague, so that had to be narrowed down. That later became the measure of clear and present danger. In other words, imminent harm of lawless action. So here's an example. An anti-war protester on a college campus named Gregory Hess had been arrested for disorderly conduct after he shouted that protesters would, quote, take the fucking street later, end of quote. The court overturned this conviction on the grounds that Hess's speech, quote, amounted to nothing more than advocacy of illegal action at some indefinite future time, end of quote. In other words, that speech did not produce imminent lawless action. Basically, it's considered political hyperbole. So another example of political hyperbole would be cross-burning. Cross-burning is considered political hyperbole because it is symbolic. It's not specific. It doesn't specifically state which person to go after or which group to go after or when to go after them or how to go about going after them. It's just ugly, symbolic political speech. And so cross-burning is protected speech. You might take another example, which we see today in the case of Israel persecuting the war against the terrorist group Hamas within their borders or in the Gaza Strip. And you hear this chant. This has not gone to the Supreme Court, but it was recently discussed in Congress and was under the context of being anti-Semitic, which it, of course, is. Now, that doesn't mean that it's unprotected speech, but the quote is, or the saying, I should be more specific, would be, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And so the question was whether or not this is an imminent threat or incitement to go attack people of Jewish descent. And of course, it is not. It is, I think we probably could agree that it's an ugly statement and similar to cross-burning. But in that context, that means that it is political speech. In other words, it's not specific, it is symbolic, and it does not produce any imminent lawless action. All right. The next category would be true threats. Now, the Supreme Court of the United States defined true threats as basically statements whereby the speaker is communicating a serious expression of an intent to commit an act of violence to a specific individual or a group. The court also has held that this speech becomes unprotected intimidation because it's a type of a true threat where a speaker directs the threat to the person or group with the intention of placing that victim in fear of bodily harm or death. Now, that's a pretty high threshold to be able to categorize speech that accomplishes all of that. So we rarely see true threats go to the Supreme Court, and it's usually quite clear when someone is making what would be categorized accurately as a true threat versus, for example, symbolic speech or something like this. Now, the third category that I wanted to mention was fighting words. The original fighting words doctrine was born out of Chaplinsky versus State of New Hampshire. This is from 1942. Chaplinsky was a Jehovah's Witness, and he was convicted of disturbing the peace for yelling at a local sheriff the following, quote, "You are a goddamned racketeer, damned fascist. The whole government of Rochester are fascists and agents of fascists," end of quote. The Supreme Court upheld his conviction, creating a very narrow category of speech called fighting words that did not enjoy the protections of the First Amendment. The fighting words doctrine, as originally announced in Chaplinsky, found that two types of speech were not protected. Words that by their very utterance inflict injury, which I have no idea what those would be. That's very ambiguous, and you're unlikely to find words that actually inflict injury. And the second would be speech that incites an immediate breach of the peace. That one's a little bit more reasonable. We could probably imagine words that would violate that second standard. Fighting words are those that, by the very act of being spoken, tend to incite the individual to whom they are addressed to respond violently and to do so immediately with no time to think it over or contemplate it. This fighting words category, it's an exceedingly limited classification of speech. It basically covers only face-to-face communication that would obviously provoke an immediate and violent reaction from the average person. Again, I still think that standard is a little bit ambiguous because I can't imagine any words being said that one couldn't simply turn the other cheek and walk away. So get a good attorney if you were ever arrested for fighting words. It does seem that lewd, vulgar, or profane speech doesn't fall within the fighting words exception. They're just speech that we don't like to hear. The problem is too many college administrators continue to try and use the fighting words doctrine in order to punish and censor people on campus. So this may be just the result of confusion, or it could be bad faith. Many administrators, unfortunately, ignore the modifications made by the Supreme Court, and they use the general holding as a legal justification to censor what they might consider offensive or vulgar or profane, which is all protected speech. So one example of this could be found at University of North Carolina, Charlotte, where the fighting words harassment policy bans, quote, terms or gestures widely recognized to be derogatory references to race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and other personal characteristics, end of quote. So you can see them starting to marshal this out there as a response to this trend of trying to address identity politics. So those are the three categories of speech which may rise to the level of becoming unprotected speech. I kind of mentioned harassment there at the end. I think the policies that some of these college administrators may implement are simply aimed at trying to curb harassment, which is understandable. However, the problem with harassment is that the threshold there is that the harassment must interfere with access. So you would have to verbally attack people in such a way where it would interfere with their access. And we typically have other laws to handle this. So you might imagine someone, an individual who is stalking a person. Now, you could understand how that would rise to the level of interfering with access. You're going to create, imminent fear in a person of being harmed or injured, perhaps physically. But if I were to follow someone back to their dorm every single day, cursing at them and calling them names and doing these kinds of things, it's easy to understand at that point how that could rise to the level of interfering with that person's access to the university. They may be afraid to go outside, they may not want to go places alone, etc. So unless it's repeated and consistent, it's also easy to imagine how a person could simply turn the other cheek and walk away. So the standards are very high in order to qualify any speech as being unprotected, as well they should be. And that keeps a nice, robust environment for free speech, while also protecting people from imminent harm or violence. I believe that it is worth mentioning some college administrators who may seek to implement these harassment policies are doing so with the best of intentions. I don't think anyone would want to advocate for people to be called names on the basis of their identity or attacked for such a thing. The problem is none of that actually rises to the level of unprotected speech. It has much more to do with the identity politics, which characterizes the time that we are living through. So harassment thereby would be yet another measure in order to try to determine whether or not speech may rise to the level of becoming unprotected speech. I hope this has been illuminating for you, and I have cleared up some of the concerns and questions that you may have had about what could potentially rise to the level of becoming unprotected speech.